When I met my wife's parents for the first time, my wife's mother threw wine in my face and said, "That's to disinfect a poor man. Her monthly expense is $140,000. My wife laughed, so I smiled and said, "I'm canceling all business with your company." I should have known something was off when Talia spent 3 hours getting ready that morning, changing her outfit 4 times and asking me twice if I was absolutely sure about the wine I'd chosen. But hell, I was 26, head over heels in love, and stupid enough to think that dropping $200 on a bottle of Bordeaux would somehow prove I was worthy of dating a Castell. The Castell estate sat behind wrought iron gates in the most exclusive part of Beacon Hill, the kind of neighborhood where the mailboxes probably cost more than most people's cars. As we pulled up the circular driveway in my beat-up Honda Civic, yeah, I know, real smooth, I caught sight of the house for the first time. It wasn't just big. It was the kind of massive that makes you feel like an ant walking up to a wedding cake. Colonial architecture, perfectly manicured gardens, and enough marble to build a small monument. This wasn't just wealth. This was generational, old money, we built Boston kind of wealth. I'd practiced my introduction in the mirror that morning, rehearsed stories about my business, even looked up proper wine etiquette on YouTube. I was wearing my only good suit, a navy blue number I'd bought on sale at Men's Warehouse, and I'd spent an hour making sure my shoes were spotless. My palms were sweating as we walked up those pristine stone steps, but I kept telling myself this was just dinner with my girlfriend's parents. How bad could it be? Talia rang the doorbell instead of just walking in, which should have been my second red flag. When the massive oak door swung open, I got my first look at Miranda Castell in person. I'd seen photos, sure, but pictures don't capture the way someone can look at you like you're something they scraped off their shoe. She was tall, elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and the kind of bone structure that screamed, "I summer in the Hamptons." Her eyes, ice blue, just like Talia's, swept over me from head to toe in about 2 seconds, and I could practically see her calculating my net worth based on my discount suit and drugstore cologne. "Mother, this is Griffin," Talia said, and I swear her voice sounded different already, more refined, like she was slipping back into some version of herself I'd never met. I stepped forward with what I hoped was a confident smile, extending my hand and the wine bottle simultaneously. "Mrs. Castell, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you. Talia's told me so much about." She didn't take my hand. Instead, she stared at the bottle like I'd just handed her a dead rat. "Chateau Margaux, 2015, she said, reading the label with the kind of disdain usually reserved for parking tickets. How quaint. That's when her husband Maurice appeared behind her, looking like Central Casting's idea of a wealthy New England patriarch. Tall, distinguished, wearing a cardigan that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He at least shook my hand, though it felt like grabbing a limp fish. "So you're the young man who's been occupying so much of our daughter's time," he said, and somehow he made it sound like an accusation. The dining room was exactly what you'd expect. Chandelier the size of a small car, oil paintings of dead relatives glaring down from the walls, and a table that could seat the starting lineup of the Patriots with room for the coaching staff. I was seated across from Miranda, which I quickly realized was strategic. She had a clear line of sight to study me like a specimen under a microscope. Dinner started civil enough. Small talk about the weather, questions about my work situation. I explained that I ran a small logistics company, trying to make it sound more impressive than it was. When Maurice asked about my family background, I gave them the sanitized version. Parents died when I was young, raised by my grandmother, worked my way through college on scholarships. I left out the part about sleeping in my car sophomore year and eating ramen for every meal. But Miranda wasn't interested in polite conversation. As the main course was being served, some fancy lamb dish that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, she leaned back in her chair and really looked at me for the first time. "Griffin," she said, and my name sounded wrong coming from her mouth, like she was testing out a foreign word. "Talia tells us you're quite ambitious." The way she said ambitious made it sound like a character flaw. "I believe in working hard for what you want," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile a shark probably gives right before it attacks. "How refreshing. Tell me, what exactly do you want?" I looked at Talia, hoping for some kind of support, but she was suddenly very interested in her wine glass. I want to build something meaningful. I want to take care of the people I love. How much do you make a year? Miranda asked, cutting straight to the heart of it. Mother. Talia finally spoke up, but her voice was weak, embarrassed. It's a fair question, Miranda continued. After all, our daughter has certain expectations, certain standards of living she's accustomed to. She gestured around the room like she was showcasing a museum exhibit. Talia's monthly expenses alone are around $140,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $140,000. That was more than I made in 2 years when I was starting out. More than most people made, period. I felt my face getting hot, that familiar burn of shame I'd felt so many times growing up poor. But I managed to keep my voice level. I'm sure we can work something out. That's when Miranda picked up her wine glass. The good wine, not the bottle I'd brought, which I noticed hadn't even been opened, and stood up. For a second, I thought maybe she was going to propose a toast, some kind of peace offering. Instead, she walked around the table, stood directly in front of me, and without any warning at all, threw the entire glass of wine right in my face. The cold liquid hit me like a slap, soaking into my shirt, dripping down my chin. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, could smell the expensive lamb getting cold on our plates. That's to disinfect a poor man, she said, her voice as cold as Arctic wind. And then, God, this still gets to me, Talia laughed. Not a nervous giggle or an uncomfortable chuckle. She actually laughed, like her mother had just told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. I sat there for a moment, wine dripping onto my good suit, feeling smaller than I'd felt since I was a kid getting free lunch at school, while other kids had money for pizza day. I could have gotten angry, could have stormed out, could have said something I'd regret. Instead, I very slowly reached for my napkin, wiped my face clean, and stood up. I looked Miranda Castell straight in the eye and smiled. Not the nervous, trying to please smile I'd been wearing all evening, but something else entirely. Something that probably should have warned her. Well, I said, my voice perfectly calm. I guess I'll be canceling all business with Castell Urban Estates then. The look of confusion that crossed her face was almost worth the humiliation. Almost. That was the night I stopped trying to fit in with the Castells. That was the night I realized they'd never see me as anything more than the poor kid who got lucky enough to date their daughter. That was also the night I started planning their downfall. I just didn't know it yet. My name is Griffin Morrow. And if you're expecting some sob story about the poor orphan boy who made good, you're going to be disappointed. Sure, I grew up with nothing, bounced between foster homes until I was 16, slept in my car during my freshman year of college, and yeah, I've eaten more ramen noodles than any human being should survive. But I'm not here for your pity. I'm here because I built something from absolutely nothing, and when the people who should have respected that decided to treat me like their personal entertainment, I made damn sure they'd regret it. The thing about being an orphan is that it teaches you early that the only person you can count on is yourself. When I was 8 and living with the Hendersons, foster family number 3, I learned that if I wanted new shoes for school, I better start collecting cans and bottles for the recycling money. When I was 12 and staying with the Kowalskis, I figured out that doing odd jobs around the neighborhood paid better than hoping for an allowance. By the time I aged out of the system at 18, I had a work ethic that could cut through steel and zero tolerance for people who thought the world owed them something. College was a joke at first, not the education part. I was hungry for that, but trying to fit in with kids who complained about their parents cutting their credit card limits while I was washing dishes in the cafeteria to pay for textbooks. I studied business and logistics because I knew those were practical skills, things that would actually make money in the real world. While my classmates were pledging fraternities and going on spring break trips to Cancun, I was working 3 part-time jobs and reading every business book I could get my hands on. The logistics company started in my dorm room sophomore year. Nothing fancy, just me with a beat-up laptop, helping local businesses coordinate their deliveries more efficiently. I saw inefficiencies everywhere and figured out how to fix them for a price. By graduation, I was pulling in decent money. Not Castell money, mind you, but enough to rent a real apartment and buy food that didn't come in a foam cup. That's when I met Talia. She was working at an art gallery downtown, not because she needed the money, obviously, but because Daddy thought it would be good for her character to have some kind of job before joining the family business. I walked in looking for a painting for my new office, something that would make clients think I was more established than I actually was. She was standing in front of this massive abstract piece, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car, and when she turned around and smiled at me, I felt like I'd been hit by lightning. "You look lost," she said, and her voice had this quality to it, like she was genuinely interested in helping rather than just doing her job. "Completely," I admitted. "I know nothing about art, but I need something that says successful businessman instead of guy who eats cereal for dinner." She laughed, a real laugh, not the fake tittering I'd heard from rich girls before, and spent the next hour showing me around, explaining different styles and artists. She didn't talk down to me or make me feel stupid for not knowing the difference between Impressionism and Expressionism. When I finally picked out a piece, something affordable but classy, she insisted on personally overseeing the delivery. That first year with Talia was like living in a dream I was afraid to wake up from. She called me refreshing and real, said I was different from the guys she usually dated. We'd spend hours talking about everything, my business plans, her family, books we'd read, places we wanted to travel. She seemed genuinely interested in my background, asked thoughtful questions about growing up in foster care, and never once made me feel like she was slumming it by dating someone from my side of the tracks. But meeting her family? That was when reality came crashing back in. The Castells didn't just have money. They had the kind of old, established wealth that came with automatic membership in the right clubs, summer houses in Martha's Vineyard, and the unshakable belief that some people were simply born better than others. Castell Urban Estates had been developing prime Boston real estate for 3 generations, turning empty lots into luxury condos and historic buildings into exclusive shopping centers. They didn't just own property, they owned pieces of the city's identity. Maurice Castell treated me like an interesting specimen, polite enough on the surface, but with this underlying condescension that made it clear he thought I was a phase his daughter was going through. He'd ask questions about my business with the kind of fake interest people use when they're really just waiting for you to stop talking. "How fascinating," he'd say after I explained some deal I was working on, in the same tone you'd use to compliment a child's finger painting. But it was Declan, Talia's younger brother, who really got under my skin. Fresh out of Harvard Business School with an MBA he'd never had to use for anything more challenging than managing his trust fund, he had this way of looking at me like I was some kind of charity case his sister had dragged home. During family dinners, he'd make little comments about my clothes, my car, my quaint little shipping business. When I showed up to Talia's birthday party wearing a watch I'd bought myself after landing a particularly good contract, nothing crazy expensive, just a decent Seiko that actually kept time. Declan spent 20 minutes talking about his Rolex collection and how vintage timepieces were such a fascinating investment opportunity. The worst part was how Talia started changing around them. Not all at once, and maybe she didn't even realize it was happening, but gradually she began slipping back into their world and their way of thinking. She'd correct my grammar at dinner parties. She'd suggest I might want to invest in some better suits for important events. When I mentioned wanting to expand my business into new markets, she'd smile indulgently and say things like, "That's so ambitious of you, sweetheart." But I stayed. I smiled through their condescension, laughed at Declan's jokes about my background, and pretended not to notice when Maurice introduced me to his business associates as Talia's friend Griffin instead of her boyfriend. I told myself it was because I loved her, and that was partly true. But if I'm being honest, there was another reason I stuck around. I was learning. Every family dinner was a masterclass in how old money operated. Every charity gala and country club event was an opportunity to observe the networks that really ran this city. While they were busy looking down on me, I was quietly taking notes on their business practices, their financial strategies, their weaknesses. And I was building my own empire in the shadows. The logistics company grew. I diversified into supply chain management, then into warehousing, then into commercial real estate. I was careful to keep my expansion quiet, using different company names and shell corporations. While the Castells were focused on their traditional development projects, I was buying up the infrastructure that made their developments possible. When Talia and I got married 3 years after that first disastrous dinner, I paid for half the wedding myself. Not because they asked me to, but because I wanted them to know I could. The reception was at the Boston Harbor Hotel, 200 guests, open bar, live band, the works. During his toast, Maurice managed to work in a joke about how lucky I was to be joining their family. I smiled and raised my glass, but inside I was doing calculations. I'd already started acquiring their debt through intermediary companies. I'd already identified their most vulnerable properties. I'd already begun the long, careful process of positioning myself to take everything they'd built. While they laughed at the poor kid who got lucky, I was quietly becoming the one thing they'd never expect, someone powerful enough to destroy them. The night I walked into my living room and found Talia curled up on my couch with Sebastian Locke, their new VP of development, a smooth-talking pretty boy with an Ivy League pedigree and absolutely no idea that I'd been planning this moment for years. I knew it was finally time to stop pretending to be grateful for their acceptance. It was time to take everything they thought belonged to them and make them beg for mercy they'd never shown me. The thing about catching your wife cheating is that everyone expects you to lose your shit. They expect yelling, screaming, maybe some furniture getting thrown around. What they don't expect is for you to stand there for exactly 30 seconds, memorize every detail of the scene, then calmly walk upstairs to pack your briefcase while your entire world shifts into crystal clear focus. That's exactly what I did. Talia was wearing the silk robe I'd bought her for our anniversary, the one that cost me a week's worth of grocery money back when every dollar mattered. Sebastian had his shirt off, showing off the kind of gym-sculpted abs that come from having a personal trainer and enough free time to actually use him. They were sharing a bottle of wine, the good stuff from our cellar, probably something worth more than most people's monthly rent, and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. In my house, on my couch, drinking my wine. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was happening the same day I'd finally finished acquiring the last piece of the puzzle I needed to destroy her family. For 3 years, I'd been playing the long game, buying up their debts through shell companies, positioning myself to take control of everything they'd built. Today was supposed to be the day I celebrated in private, maybe opened a nice bottle of champagne and toasted to the beautiful symmetry of it all. Instead, I got to watch my wife of 5 years giggle like a schoolgirl while another man's hands explored territory that used to be mine. But here's the thing about growing up with nothing. It teaches you that emotional reactions are luxuries you can't afford. When you're 8 years old and your foster family tells you they're not the right fit and you need to pack your stuff again, you learn to compartmentalize. When you're 16 and aging out of the system with nowhere to go, you learn that survival requires keeping your head clear even when your heart is breaking. So I watched for 30 seconds, just long enough to burn the image into my memory, then turned around and walked upstairs to my home office. The briefcase was already mostly packed, financial documents, contracts, the keys to safety deposit boxes they didn't know existed. I added the final piece, a folder containing every piece of evidence I compiled over the years about Castell Urban Estate's financial vulnerabilities. Bank statements obtained through perfectly legal channels. Public records that painted a picture of a company living beyond its means. Loan documents that showed just how leveraged they really were. I also grabbed something else, a framed photo from my desk. Not of Talia and me on our wedding day, but one of my grandmother, the only person who'd ever really given a damn about me before I learned to stop needing anyone to. She died my senior year of college, right before everything started taking off for me. I kept her picture on my desk as a reminder of where I came from and why I never wanted to go back. Looking at her wrinkled face and kind eyes, I could almost hear her voice. Griffin, baby, sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, even if it doesn't feel well. Thanks, Grandma. This definitely doesn't feel like a gift right now, but I'm starting to see the possibilities. I closed the briefcase, straightened my tie, and walked back downstairs. Talia and Sebastian were so wrapped up in each other, they didn't even notice me pass by the living room on my way to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of coffee, good stuff, imported beans that cost $30 a pound, and sat at the kitchen island going over my plan one more time. At exactly 11:47 p.m., I made a phone call to my lawyer, Marcus Feinberg. Marcus had been with me since the early days, back when I was just some kid with big dreams and a rapidly growing logistics company. He'd handled every major deal I'd ever made, and more importantly, he was one of the few people who knew the full scope of what I'd been building in the shadows. Griffin? Jesus, it's almost midnight. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Marcus. Everything's actually perfect. I need you to prepare the paperwork for tomorrow morning. All of it. There was a pause. Marcus had been expecting this call for months, but I could hear him processing the implications. You're sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. What about Talia? I glanced toward the living room, where I could hear my wife's laughter mixing with another man's voice. Talia made her choice. Now I'm making mine. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of that expensive wine. Might as well enjoy it one last time, and went upstairs to bed. Alone, obviously, since my wife was otherwise occupied. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and fell asleep easier than I had in months. The helicopter landed on our front lawn at exactly 8 a.m. I'd arranged it 3 days ago, as soon as I knew the final pieces were falling into place. The pilot was a guy named Tommy Reeves who ran a charter service out of Logan Airport. Former military, discreet, and completely unimpressed by wealthy neighborhoods or the people who lived in them. Perfect for what I needed. The sound of rotor blades chopping through the morning air was loud enough to wake half the neighborhood. I was already dressed, my best suit, the one I'd been saving for special occasions, and had my briefcase in hand when I heard movement from downstairs. Griffin, Talia's voice, confused and slightly panicked. Griffin, what the hell is that noise? I walked calmly down the stairs, checking my watch. Right on schedule. Through the living room windows, I could see neighbors starting to gather on their lawns, pointing and taking pictures with their phones. Mrs. Henderson from next door was recording everything on her iPad. Perfect. Talia stumbled out of the living room wearing that silk robe. Her hair a mess, Sebastian nowhere to be seen. Probably hiding in the bathroom like the coward he was. What's happening? She demanded, having to raise her voice over the helicopter noise. I smiled at her, the same calm, controlled smile I'd perfected during 8 years of her family's condescension. I'm going to work. In a helicopter? Griffin, have you lost your mind? The neighbors are going to think. The neighbors can think whatever they want, I said, heading for the front door. By the time I get back, this won't be our problem anymore. What do you mean by that? I paused at the door, briefcase in hand, and looked back at my wife of 5 years. The woman who'd called me refreshing when we first met. The woman who'd gradually learned to be embarrassed by my background. The woman who was currently wearing the robe I'd bought her while having an affair with another man in the house I'd paid for. You'll figure it out, I said. Then I walked out to the helicopter, climbed in, and told Tommy to take me to downtown Boston. As we lifted off, I looked down at the house that had been my home for 3 years. Talia was standing in the doorway, her robe clutched around her, staring up at us with an expression I'd never seen before. Not confusion anymore. Fear. Smart girl. She was finally starting to understand. 15 minutes later, Tommy set us down on the roof of the building that housed Castell Urban Estates' corporate headquarters. The same building where Maurice had his corner office with the view of Boston Harbor. The same building where Declan had his mahogany desk and his collection of vintage paperweights. The same building where Sebastian Locke had been promoted to VP of Development just 6 months ago. I walked into their boardroom at exactly 8:47 a.m., briefcase in hand, smile on my face. They were all there for the monthly board meeting. Maurice, Declan, Sebastian, and 3 other executives whose names I'd never bothered to learn because they were about to become irrelevant. The looks of shock on their faces when I walked in were almost worth the 8 years of humiliation I'd endured. Good morning, everyone, I said, setting my briefcase on the polished conference table. Sorry I'm late. Traffic was murder. Maurice found his voice first. Griffin, what are you doing here? How did you even get up here? I opened my briefcase and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. Marcus had done beautiful work, every document perfectly organized, every signature properly notarized, every legal detail absolutely airtight. I'm here for the same reason you're here, I said, to discuss the future of Castell Urban Estates. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them. Sebastian couldn't even look at me directly. Coward. Gentlemen, I said, I'm pleased to inform you that as of 9 a.m. this morning, I own 73% of this company. The silence that followed was beautiful. You could have heard a pin drop on that thick Persian rug. Marcus appeared in the doorway right on cue, carrying his own briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that meant billable hours were about to get very expensive for someone. Through a network of holding companies and strategic debt acquisition, Marcus said, handing out copies of the documentation to everyone at the table. My client has gained controlling interest in Castell Urban Estates and all subsidiary holdings. I stood up and straightened my tie, the same gesture I'd made 1,000 times in this room while they looked down on me. "You're all fired," I said, looking at Sebastian last. "Security will escort you out. Your personal belongings will be shipped to you." Then I turned to face the window, looking out at the city I was about to help reshape. "Oh, and by the way, Talia," I said, even though she wasn't there to hear it, "our accounts are closed, the house is mortgaged to me, and the divorce papers will arrive this afternoon." The best part? I was just getting started. The story broke on Twitter first, because of course it did. Mrs. Henderson from next door, the one with the iPad who'd filmed my helicopter departure, had posted a video with the caption, "Neighbor just left for work in a helicopter this morning? What kind of job does this guy have?" By noon, it had 12,000 views, and people were commenting with theories ranging from drug dealer to secret government agent. Then the business reporters got hold of it. By 2 p.m., Boston Business Journal had the headline, "Local logistics CO executes hostile takeover of wife's family empire." By 4 p.m., the Globe was running with "From Foster Care to Fortune, the Griffin Morrow Story." And by 6 p.m., some genius at New York Magazine had coined the phrase that would follow me for the next 6 months. "Orphan-turned-mogul destroys wife's empire overnight." I was sitting in what used to be Morris's corner office, my corner office now, watching the coverage on 3 different news channels when Marcus walked in with a grin wider than the Charles River. "You're trending on social media," he said, setting down a stack of legal documents that needed my signature. Number 3 nationwide, right behind a celebrity breakup and a video of a cat playing piano. "Fantastic," I muttered, signing my name to another transfer of assets. I always wanted to be famous for ruining my marriage and destroying my in-laws in the same morning. "Don't be modest," Marcus said. "You've been planning this for 3 years. The execution was flawless. Every single acquisition was legal. Every debt purchase was legitimate. Every contract was ironclad. They don't have a leg to stand on." He was right, of course. I'd been meticulous about staying on the right side of the law. Every shell company had proper documentation. Every loan purchase had gone through the correct channels. Every hostile takeover maneuver had been executed with surgical precision. The Castells could hate me all they wanted, but they couldn't sue me. That didn't stop them from trying other approaches. The first call came at 6:23 p.m. Declan, sounding like he'd been crying, which honestly was more satisfying than I care to admit. "Griffin, please. We can work something out. There has to be some kind of arrangement we can make." "There is," I told him. "It's called unemployment. I hear McDonald's is hiring. This is insane. You can't just destroy an entire family business because you're mad at Talia. Watch me." I hung up and immediately blocked his number. 30 seconds later, my phone rang again. This time it was Talia herself. "Griffin, I know you're angry." "Angry?" I interrupted. "Talia, anger is what you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic. This is something else entirely. I made a mistake. I was drunk. I was lonely. You were fucking another man in our living room," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "On our couch, drinking our wine, in our house that I paid for." The silence stretched for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then I heard something I'd never heard from Talia Castell in all the years I'd known her. She was crying. Not the pretty, delicate tears she used to get sympathy. Ugly, desperate sobbing. "Please," she whispered. "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But my family, they don't deserve this. My father worked his whole life to build this company. Your father worked his whole life to maintain what his grandfather built." I corrected. "There's a difference. And you're right. You don't deserve forgiveness. Neither do they. What do you want from me?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself all day. What did I want? The obvious answer was revenge, and I was certainly getting that. The Castell family name would be forever associated with their spectacular downfall. Their social standing in Boston's elite circles was effectively destroyed. Their business empire was now mine to do with as I pleased. But as I sat there in Morris's old chair, looking out at the city lights starting to twinkle in the growing darkness, I realized that revenge wasn't actually what I wanted most. "I want you to understand something," I told her. "For 8 years, I tried to earn your family's respect. I smiled through their jokes about my background. I pretended not to notice when they talked down to me. I bit my tongue when your brother made comments about my clothes or my car or my quaint little business. I did all of that because I loved you. And I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved myself worthy enough, they'd eventually accept me. They did accept. No, they didn't. And neither did you. You know how I know? Because the night they made jokes about my dead parents, in my own house, at a dinner party I was paying for, you laughed along with them. You actually laughed. I could hear her crying harder now, but I wasn't done. I realized that night that you never loved me. You loved the idea of fixing me. You loved having a project, a diamond in the rough you could polish up and show off to your friends. But you were always ashamed of where I came from, and you were never going to let me forget it. That's not true. It is true. And you know what the really fucked up part is? While you were all busy looking down on me, I was quietly becoming more successful than any of you ever dreamed of being. I own half the supply chains in this city. I control the logistics networks that make your family's developments possible. I've been building an empire while you thought I was just some lucky peasant who married up. The line went quiet except for her muffled sobs. Griffin, she said finally, there's something I need to tell you. About Sebastian. About a child. That stopped me cold. In all my planning, in all my careful preparation for this moment, I'd never considered that possibility. What child? His name is Elian. He's 6 years old. Sebastian is his father. The words hit me like a physical blow. Talia had a child. With Sebastian. A 6-year-old boy I'd never even known existed. Where is he? With my Aunt Catherine in Providence. She's been helping me raise him. Sebastian left when I told him I was pregnant. He came back a few months ago, said he wanted to try again. That's when things started between us again. My mind was racing, trying to process this information and fit it into everything I thought I knew about my wife, my marriage, my entire life for the past 6 years. You've had a child for 6 years and never told me? I was scared. My family was already disappointed in me for getting pregnant by someone who wasn't my husband. I didn't know how to explain it. Someone who wasn't your husband? The words came out sharper than I intended. Talia, when exactly was this child born? Another long pause. Then, in a voice so small I could barely hear it. February 14th, 2018. I did the math. We'd been married for 2 years by then. She'd been cheating on me almost from the beginning of our marriage, and had a child with another man while she was married to me. Before I could respond, my other line started ringing. Marcus's number. I have to go, I told Talia. Griffin, wait. I switched to the other line. What is it, Marcus? We have a problem. Maurice Castell is in the hospital. Massive heart attack about an hour ago. He's in intensive care at Mass General. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples. This wasn't part of the plan. Destroying someone's business was one thing. Being responsible for putting them in the hospital was something else entirely. How bad? Bad. His doctors aren't sure he's going to make it through the night. I looked out the window at the city I'd conquered in a single day, at the empire I'd built from nothing, at the revenge I'd executed with surgical precision. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd planned, everything I'd dreamed about for 3 years. And now there was a child. A 6-year-old boy named Elian who existed because my wife had been cheating on me longer than I'd realized. And there was an old man in a hospital bed, fighting for his life because I'd destroyed everything he'd spent his lifetime building. This was supposed to be the best day of my life. So why did I feel like I was drowning? The Providence Children's Museum was probably the last place I expected to have my entire worldview shifted, but life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. I'd driven down to Rhode Island the morning after Morris's heart attack, partly because I needed to see this kid Talia had hidden from me for 6 years, and partly because I needed to get out of Boston before the media circus got any more intense. Catherine Rossi, Talia's aunt and apparently the woman who'd been raising my wife's secret child, lived in a Victorian house on the east side that looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. White picket fence, rose bushes, the whole 9 yards. She answered the door wearing an apron covered in flour, looking like she'd stepped out of a 1950s cookbook. You must be Griffin, she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, which honestly surprised me. After 8 years of the Castell family treating me like an interesting science experiment, I'd gotten used to being evaluated the moment I walked into a room. Mrs. Rossi, thank you for agreeing to see me. Please, call me Catherine. And thank you for coming. Elian's been asking about you ever since Talia told him you might visit. That stopped me cold. She told him about me? Catherine smiled, but it was sad around the edges. Honey, that boy has been asking about his father for years. When Sebastian disappeared, Talia was heartbroken and scared. She told Elian that his daddy had to go away for work, but that someday there might be someone else who could be like a father to him. She led me into the living room, which was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who'd spent her life taking care of other people's children. Toys organized in neat bins, children's books stacked on every surface, and artwork that was clearly made by small hands taped to the refrigerator. He's upstairs getting ready, Catherine said. I should warn you, he's nervous. He's been changing his shirt for the past hour, trying to decide what would make the best impression. Before I could respond, I heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by a voice that made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. Aunt Catherine, does this shirt make me look responsible? I turned around and got my first look at Elian Castell, and I swear to God, it was like looking at a photograph of myself at that age. Same dark hair that refused to lie flat, no matter how much you combed it. Same serious expression, like he was constantly trying to figure out how the world worked. Same green eyes that seemed to see too much for someone so young. But there was something else there too, something I recognized but had almost forgotten: hope. The kind of desperate, carefully guarded hope that kids in the system learn to carry around like a secret. He was wearing a button-down shirt that was slightly too big for him, navy blue with thin white stripes, and he'd obviously spent time making sure it was tucked in properly. His hair was slicked back with what looked like half a bottle of gel, and he was carrying a small manila folder like he was heading to a job interview. You must be Griffin, he said, walking over with the kind of formal confidence that breaks your heart because you know exactly where it comes from. I'm Elian. It's very nice to meet you. He stuck out his hand for a handshake, and I noticed his nails were bitten down to the quick. A nervous habit I remembered well from my own childhood. It's nice to meet you too, Elian, I said, kneeling down so we were at eye level. That's a very sharp shirt. He beamed at the compliment, and some of the formal mask slipped away. Aunt Catherine helped me pick it out. She said first impressions are important. She's absolutely right. What's in the folder? My report card and some drawings I made. I thought you might want to see them. He paused, then added with the kind of earnestness that only 6-year-olds can manage. I'm a very good student, and I can make my own breakfast. Jesus Christ. This kid was interviewing to be adopted. Catherine must have seen something in my expression because she suddenly found a reason to busy herself in the kitchen, leaving us alone. Elian sat down on the couch next to me, carefully opening his folder. This is my report card from last semester, he said, handing me a piece of paper like he was presenting evidence in court. I got all A's except for handwriting, but Mrs. Peterson says that's normal for boys my age. The report card was impressive. He demonstrates remarkable problem-solving skills and isn't afraid to ask thoughtful questions. Elian has a maturity beyond his years and often helps other students when they're struggling. This is really impressive, Elian. You should be proud of yourself. Thank you. He pulled out a stack of drawings next. These are some pictures I made. This one is our house, and this one is Aunt Catherine's garden, and this one. He hesitated, holding up a drawing that made my throat close up completely. It was a picture of a man and a boy standing in front of what looked like a building with lots of windows. The man was wearing a suit and tie, and the boy was holding his hand. At the bottom, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, it said, "Me and my new dad at work." I know you have a big company, Elian said, not quite meeting my eyes. Aunt Catherine showed me the pictures in the newspaper. I thought maybe someday you could show me your office. I stared at that drawing for a long time, trying to process what I was feeling. This kid, this smart, hopeful, resilient kid, had been dreaming about having a father figure who would take him to work, who would be proud of him, who would stick around. Elian, I said finally, what did your mom tell you about why I wanted to meet you? He fidgeted with the corner of his folder. She said that she and Daddy Sebastian had some problems, and that you might be able to help take care of me. She said you're very smart and very successful, and that you might want to be my new dad. The way he said, Daddy Sebastian, made it clear that Sebastian had been in his life recently enough for Elian to remember him, which meant this kid had already been abandoned once by his biological father. How do you feel about that? I asked. Honestly, always. I'm scared you won't like me, he said in a small voice. Daddy Sebastian said he wanted to be my real dad, but then he went away again. Aunt Catherine says it's not my fault. But I keep thinking maybe if I was better at sports or if I didn't ask so many questions. That's when something inside me just broke open. This kid was carrying around the same fears I'd lived with my entire childhood. That somehow, if I could just be good enough, smart enough, quiet enough, maybe someone would want to keep me. Elian, look at me. I waited until he met my eyes. There is nothing wrong with you. Nothing you could do or not do would make someone not want you. Sometimes adults make bad choices that have nothing to do with kids. Really, really. And you know what? I think you ask exactly the right number of questions. Smart people ask questions. He smiled at that, a real smile this time instead of his nervous interview smile. Can I ask you a question? He said. Shoot. If you became my dad, would you teach me about business? I want to learn how to make money so I can take care of Aunt Catherine when she gets old. And that's when I knew. Looking at this 6-year-old boy who was already thinking about taking care of the people he loved, who was smart enough to get straight A's and kind enough to help his struggling classmates, who had been abandoned by his biological father but still had enough hope left to dream about finding a new one. I knew I wanted to be the person he was hoping for. Yeah, I said, I think I could teach you a few things about business. The smile that spread across his face was brighter than every corporate victory I'd ever achieved. Does that mean you want to be my dad? I looked at this remarkable kid who somehow existed because of the worst betrayal of my marriage, and realized that sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you didn't know you needed. Yeah, Elian, I think I'd like that very much. He launched himself at me in a hug that nearly knocked me over, and for the first time in my life, I understood what people meant when they talked about unconditional love. Can I call you Dad? He whispered against my shoulder. If you want to. Dad, he said, trying it out. Then louder, Dad. And just like that, everything I thought I knew about revenge and justice and what I wanted from life got turned completely upside down. I wasn't just destroying the Castells anymore. I was building something new. Sebastian Locke showed up at my office the next morning looking like he'd slept in his car and spent the night rehearsing excuses. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and he had the kind of hollow-eyed look that comes from knowing your entire life is about to implode. When my assistant Janet buzzed to let me know he was here, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Send him in, I told her. And Janet, hold all my calls. This won't take long. Sebastian walked into my office, Morris's old office, which I'd already started redecorating, like a man heading to his own execution. He'd been handsome once, I could see that. The kind of prep school pretty boy who'd spent his whole life coasting on good looks and family connections. But whatever charm he'd used to seduce my wife was nowhere to be found now. He looked desperate, cornered, and completely out of his depth. Griffin, he said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Sit down, Sebastian. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where I'd sat through countless meetings with Maurice, pretending to be grateful for whatever scraps of respect they threw my way. The irony wasn't lost on me that now Sebastian was the one sitting there, hat in hand. He sat down carefully, like he was afraid the chair might explode. Look, I know this situation is complicated, but I think we can work something out that benefits everyone involved. Really, I leaned back in my leather chair and studied him. Up close, I could see he was younger than I'd initially thought, probably 28, 29 at most. Young enough to still believe that charm and good intentions could fix the kind of mess he'd created. Tell me, Sebastian, what exactly do you think would benefit me in this situation? Well, obviously the business arrangement is between you and the Castells. I'm not trying to interfere with that. But when it comes to Elian, he trailed off, apparently realizing he was walking into a minefield. Yes, let's talk about Elian. I opened the manila folder I'd prepared the night before. Marcus had worked until 3 a.m. putting together everything we could find on Sebastian Locke, and what we discovered was even worse than I'd expected. Tell me, Sebastian, is Locke even your real last name? The color drained from his face. I don't know what you mean. I mean Sebastian Locke doesn't exist. Sebastian Larkin, on the other hand, that's a different story. I pulled out the first document from the folder. Born in Hartford, Connecticut. Graduated from UConn, not Harvard like you told the Castells. Worked for 3 different development companies before this job, and you were fired from all 3. I pulled out another sheet. Baxter and Associates in Hartford. Terminated for falsifying environmental impact reports. Morrison Development in New Haven, terminated for having an affair with the boss's wife. Steinberg Properties in Stamford, terminated for embezzling funds from client accounts. Sebastian's hands were shaking now. Those are all misunderstandings. I was never charged with anything. Because you were smart enough to disappear before they could press charges. I pulled out the final document, the one that had taken Marcus's investigator the longest to track down. And then there's the matter of Jennifer Walsh in Hartford. Remember Jennifer, Sebastian? 23 years old, waitress at that diner near your apartment? The one who ended up pregnant after you disappeared. His face went completely white. How do you? The same way I found out about the environmental fraud you covered up for Morrison Development. The same way I found out about the money you stole from Steinberg Properties. The same way I found out that Locke isn't your real name, and Harvard never heard of you. I leaned forward, my voice perfectly calm. I make it my business to know everything about people who fuck with my family. Your family? He laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. Griffin, she's not your family. Elian isn't your son. This is all just some elaborate revenge fantasy, because you caught your wife cheating. You're right, I said. Elian isn't my son. Yet. But he's going to be. And that's where you come in. I pulled out the adoption papers Marcus had drawn up, along with a document that would legally terminate all of Sebastian's parental rights. You're going to sign these papers, Sebastian. All of them. You're going to give up any claim to that boy, and then you're going to disappear from his life forever. And if I don't, I smiled the same way I'd learned to smile during 8 years of Castell family dinners. Polite, controlled, and absolutely lethal. Then I make some phone calls. First one goes to the FBI field office in Boston, letting them know about your environmental fraud activities. Second one goes to the IRS, with detailed information about the money you embezzled. Third one goes to Jennifer Walsh in Hartford, letting her know exactly where to find you. Sebastian stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. This is insane. You can't just steal someone's child. I'm not stealing anything. I'm offering you a choice. You can sign these papers and walk away, or you can spend the next 20 years in federal prison explaining to your cellmates why you're there. I leaned back in my chair. What's it going to be? He picked up the pen with trembling hands, then set it back down. What about Elian? What are you going to tell him about me? It was the first question he'd asked that suggested he might actually care about his son, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine emotion cross his face. I'm going to tell him the truth, I said. That his biological father made some mistakes, but that when it really mattered, he did the right thing. I'm going to tell him that you signed these papers because you wanted him to have a better life than you could give him. And that's it. I just disappear. That's it. You go back to being Sebastian Larkin or whoever the hell you really are, and you stay away from Boston. You stay away from Elian. You stay away from Talia. You start over somewhere else and try not to fuck up anyone else's life. He stared at the papers for a long time, and I could see him weighing his options. On one hand, he was giving up all rights to his biological son. On the other hand, he was avoiding federal prison and getting a chance to start fresh somewhere else. Finally, he picked up the pen and started signing. His signature was shaky, but it was legible enough to hold up in court. There, he said, pushing the papers back across the desk. Are you happy now? I'm getting there, I told him honestly. He stood up to leave, then paused at the door. Griffin, can I ask you something? What? What will you tell Elian about me when he gets older? When he starts asking questions about why his real father gave him up? I thought about the 6-year-old boy who'd hugged me so tightly yesterday, who'd called me dad like it was the most natural thing in the world, who'd already been abandoned once and was brave enough to hope for something better. I'll tell him that you made the right choice when it counted, I said. I'll tell him that sometimes love means letting go. Sebastian nodded, and for the first time since he'd walked into my office, he looked like he might actually understand the magnitude of what had just happened. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think he'll be better off with you. You've got something I never had. What's that? The ability to put someone else first. After he left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, looking at the signed papers that legally made Elian my responsibility. Outside my window, Boston was going about its business, people heading to work, tourists taking pictures, life continuing as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. But for me, everything had changed. I wasn't just Griffin Morrow, the logistics CEO anymore, or Griffin Morrow, the guy who destroyed the Castell Empire in a single day. I was going to be someone's father. And for the first time in my adult life, that felt more important than any business deal I'd ever close. Nothing prepares you for the moment a 6-year-old moves into your life, and suddenly everything you thought you knew about yourself gets turned upside down. I'd conquered corporate boardrooms, negotiated million-dollar deals, and orchestrated the systematic destruction of an entire family empire. But watching Elian walk into my house for the first time with his little suitcase and his stuffed bear made me feel like I was 17 again, completely out of my depth and hoping like hell I wouldn't screw this up. "This is really your house?" he asked, standing in my foyer and craning his neck to look up at the cathedral ceiling. "It's like a castle." "It's our house now," I corrected him, and the words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Our house, our life, our future together. He'd been quiet during the drive from Providence, clutching that manila folder with his drawings and asking careful questions about where he'd sleep and whether I had any rules he needed to know about. Catherine had packed his clothes in a suitcase that was almost as big as he was, along with a box of books and another box of what she called treasures, rocks he'd collected, certificates from school, a wooden dinosaur he'd made in art class. "Can I see my room?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made my chest tight. Hope mixed with caution, like he was trying not to get too excited in case this whole thing turned out to be temporary. I'd spent the last 2 days converting my home office into a kid's bedroom, which had involved more panic shopping than I care to admit. I'd stood in the middle of Target for an hour, staring at race car beds and superhero sheets, realizing I had no idea what a 6-year-old boy might want in his room. I'd ended up buying everything: bunk beds, a desk, shelves for books, a beanbag chair, glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling. The room looked like a toy store had exploded, but Elian's face when he saw it made every embarrassing minute of my shopping spree worth it. "Is this really all for me?" he whispered, setting down his suitcase carefully. "Every bit of it." He walked around the room like he was in a museum, touching everything gently. The desk where he could do homework. The bookshelf I'd already stocked with age-appropriate books about business and leadership, because if I was going to raise this kid, he was going to understand how the world really worked. The corner where I'd set up a small table with building blocks and puzzles. "I've never had my own room before," he said quietly. At Aunt Catherine's, I slept on the couch in the living room. She felt bad about it, but she only had one bedroom. That's when I realized just how much this kid had been through. Not just the abandonment by his biological father, but years of uncertainty, of being passed around between family members who cared about him but couldn't really provide for him. Years of sleeping on couches and being grateful for hand-me-down clothes and trying not to be too much trouble for the adults in his life. "Well, this is your room now," I told him. "For as long as you want it." He looked up at me with those serious green eyes. "Forever. Forever." That night, I learned that being a father means your own problems suddenly seem a lot less important than making sure a small person feels safe and loved. Elian wanted to know about everything: how the dishwasher worked, why I had so many suits in my closet, whether it was okay to use the good towels in the bathroom. He asked if he could help make dinner, and I realized I had no idea how to cook anything a 6-year-old would actually eat. We ended up ordering pizza and eating it on the living room floor while I showed him how to use the TV remote. Basic stuff that most parents probably figure out gradually, but we were cramming years of bonding into a few hours. "Griffin," he said around a mouthful of pepperoni pizza. "Yeah. Can I call you Dad now?" I know I did yesterday, but I wanted to make sure it was still okay. The question hit me harder than I expected. This kid who'd been let down by every adult male in his life was asking permission to trust me with the most important title anyone had ever given me. "Yeah, buddy, you can call me Dad." He smiled and went back to his pizza, like it was the most natural thing in the world. But for me, it felt like stepping across a line I could never uncross. I wasn't just Griffin Morrow anymore. I was Elian's dad. The first few weeks were like learning a foreign language. I had to figure out school schedules and bedtime routines and what constitutes appropriate breakfast food for a growing child. I learned that Elian was naturally curious about everything. He wanted to understand how elevators worked, why some people were rich and others were poor, how I'd built my company from nothing. "Were you scared?" he asked one morning over cereal, "when you were starting your business?" Terrified, I admitted. "But sometimes being scared means you're doing something important." "Is that why you adopted me?" "Because it was important even though it was scary." "Smart kid." Too smart for his own good, just like I'd been at that age. That's exactly why. I started taking him to the office on weekends, partly because I needed to catch up on work and partly because he'd asked so many times to see where I worked. He'd sit in the corner of my office with his homework or a book, occasionally asking questions about what I was doing. The cleaning staff got used to seeing this serious little boy in a suit jacket that was too big for him, carrying a briefcase I'd bought him that was an exact miniature version of mine. "Mr. Morrow," Janet said one Saturday afternoon, "that kid of yours just explained compound interest to the security guard downstairs. Is that a problem? Only if you're planning to retire early and let a 6-year-old run the company." But the real test came about 3 weeks after Elian moved in, when Talia called and asked if she could visit. She'd been in the hospital with her father, who was still recovering from his heart attack, and she sounded exhausted and broken in a way I'd never heard before. "I'd like to see him," she said, "if that's okay with you." I looked over at Elian, who was building something elaborate with Legos on the living room floor. "It's not up to me. It's up to him." When I asked Elian if he wanted to see his mom, his face went through about 6 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, hope, fear, excitement, worry, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance that made him seem way older than 6. "Will she try to take me away?" he asked. "No. This is your home now. No one can take you away from here." "Okay then. I guess I'd like to see her." Talia showed up that afternoon, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past month. She was thinner, her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer outfits. When Elian R.A. The way he said "Dad" so naturally, so proudly, made Talia look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or regret, or just recognition that this was how things were going to be now. They spent an hour together in his room, looking at his drawings and reading one of his new books. When it was time for her to leave, Elian hugged her goodbye, but didn't ask when he'd see her again. He'd already learned not to count on promises from adults. "Thank you," Talia said to me at the door, "for taking care of him, for giving him what I couldn't. He's a good kid. He is. He's the best thing I ever did." She paused, looking back toward his room. "Griffin, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but will you help him remember the good parts? About me, I mean. When he gets older and starts asking questions about why things happen the way they did." I thought about the little boy upstairs who called me Dad and trusted me to keep him safe, who asked thoughtful questions and built elaborate Lego cities and fell asleep every night secure in the knowledge that someone wanted him. "Yeah," I said, "I can do that." After she left, Elian came downstairs and found me in the kitchen, allegedly making dinner, but really just trying to process everything that had happened. "Dad?" he said, climbing up onto one of the bar stools. "Are you okay?" The fact that he was checking on me, that this 6-year-old was already learning to take care of the people he loved, made me realize something important. I wasn't just teaching him how to navigate the world. He was teaching me how to be the kind of person worth calling Dad. The invitation came on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, the kind of formal stationery that screamed old money and established power. The Boston Business Leadership Council cordially invites you to our annual Excellence in Enterprise Awards ceremony at the Beacon Hill Country Club. 6 months ago, these same people wouldn't have returned my phone calls. Now they were giving me an award and asking me to be the keynote speaker. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Do I have to wear a tie?" Elian asked, standing in front of my bedroom mirror while I helped him with his miniature tuxedo. I'd had it custom-made for the occasion. Not because I needed to show off, but because when your 6-year-old son asks if he can come to your award ceremony, you damn well make sure he looks the part. "Yes, you have to wear a tie. It's a fancy dinner. Will there be other kids there?" "Probably not many." "You sure you want to come? We could get Mrs. Rodriguez to stay with you instead." Mrs. Rodriguez was our new housekeeper, a grandmother of 5 who'd taken one look at my pathetic attempts at domestic life and decided to save us both from disaster. "I want to come," he said firmly. "I want to see you get your award." 3 months of living together had taught me that when Elian made up his mind about something, there was no point in arguing. The kid had inherited the same stubborn streak that had gotten me this far in life. We arrived at the Beacon Hill Country Club in style, not the helicopter this time, but the new Bentley I'd bought myself as a celebration gift. Elian's eyes went wide as we pulled up the circular driveway. past the perfectly manicured gardens and the Tudor-style clubhouse that had been excluding people like me for over a century. Dad, this place is huge. Yeah, buddy, it is. The valet who took our keys was the same guy who'd refused to park my beat-up Honda the one time Maurice had brought me here as a guest 5 years ago. He didn't recognize me now, of course. Back then, I was just some nobody tagging along with a real member. Tonight, I was Griffin Morrow, CEO of Morrow Legacy Group, the man who'd turned the Boston development world upside down in a single morning. Good evening, Mr. Morrow, he said with the kind of deference money commands. Congratulations on your award. Thank you. Inside, the country club was exactly as I remembered it. All dark wood and leather furniture and oil paintings of dead, white guys who'd probably made their fortunes exploiting people like my ancestors. The kind of place where the waitstaff were invisible and the membership fees cost more than most people made in a year. But tonight was different. Tonight, people turned to look when I walked in. Not with the barely concealed disdain I'd gotten used to, but with something I'd been working toward my entire adult life. Respect. Griffin. Richard Steinberg, president of the Business Leadership Council, rushed over with his hand extended. 6 months ago, this same man had forgotten to invite me to his summer fundraiser. So wonderful to see you. And this must be your son. This is Elian, I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. Elian, this is Mr. Steinberg. It's very nice to meet you, sir, Elian said, shaking hands like I'd taught him. Firm grip, eye contact, confidence without arrogance. Well, aren't you a polite young man? Griffin, you must be very proud. I am. We made our way through the cocktail hour, and I watched as people who'd treated me like a curiosity for years suddenly discovered they'd always been big fans of my work. The same executives who'd made jokes about my background now wanted to discuss potential partnerships. The same society wise who'd looked right through me at charity galas now complimented my remarkable transformation story. Elian stayed close to my side, taking it all in with those sharp green eyes. When the mayor's wife asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he answered without hesitation, a businessman like my dad. And what kind of business would you like to run? Something that helps people, he said seriously. Dad says the best businesses solve problems for other people. She looked genuinely charmed, and I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with corporate achievements or financial success. This kid got it. He understood that power without purpose was just showing off. During dinner, I found myself seated at the head table next to people who used to treat me like furniture. Judge Patricia Morrison, who'd presided over more than one business dispute involving the Castells. Dr. William Bradford, whose family had been part of Boston's elite for 8 generations. Margaret Chun, the society columnist who'd once described me in print as an interesting addition to Miss Castell's social circle. Griffin, Judge Morrison said over the salmon course, I have to ask, how did you do it? The Castell acquisition, I mean. It was brilliant, but I never would have predicted something that comprehensive. Patience, I said simply, and attention to detail. The rumor is you'd been planning it for years. The rumor is correct. She laughed, but there was genuine admiration in it. Well, I have to respect the execution. Maurice Castell has been underestimating people his entire career. I suppose it was bound to catch up with him eventually. How is Maurice doing? Dr. Bradford asked. I heard he was in the hospital. Recovering, I said. Slowly. What I didn't mention was that I'd been quietly paying for his medical bills. Not out of guilt. I wasn't sorry for what I'd done, but because destroying someone's business was one thing. Letting them die because they couldn't afford treatment was something else entirely. When it came time for the awards ceremony, Richard Steinberg stood up to introduce me with the kind of flowery language usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. This year's Excellence in Enterprise Award goes to a man who exemplifies the American dream. From humble beginnings, Griffin Morrow has built a business empire that spans multiple industries and employs thousands of people throughout New England. His innovative approaches to logistics and supply chain management have revolutionized how we think about commercial development. But perhaps more importantly, he's shown us that success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about how you achieve it. The applause was thunderous. Real applause, not the polite golf clapping I'd gotten used to at these events. As I walked to the podium, I caught sight of Elian at our table, clapping harder than anyone else, his face glowing with pride. Thank you. I said into the microphone, looking out at a room full of people who'd spent years looking down on me. 6 months ago, some of you wouldn't have returned my phone calls. Tonight, you're giving me an award. That's not a commentary on how much I've changed. It's a commentary on how much power changes people's perceptions. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience. I grew up in foster care. I worked my way through college washing dishes and cleaning offices. I built my first business in a dorm room with borrowed equipment and sheer determination. None of that has changed about me. What's changed is that now I have enough money and influence that you have to respect me. The room was completely silent now. But here's what I've learned. Respect isn't something you're given. It's something you take. And once you have it, you have a responsibility to use it wisely. I looked directly at Elian, who was watching me with absolute attention. My son asked me yesterday what makes someone successful. I told him it's not how much money you make or how many companies you own. Success is building something that makes the world better than you found it. I paused, looking around the room one more time. 8 years ago, I stood in this very club as someone's guest, trying to prove I belonged here. Tonight, I'm standing here as someone who no longer cares about belonging. I care about building. I care about creating opportunities for people like me. People who start with nothing and refuse to accept that as their ceiling. The applause when I finished was different than before. Slower, more thoughtful. Some people looked uncomfortable, but others, particularly the younger executives, were nodding in agreement. After the ceremony, as we were getting ready to leave, Elian tugged on my jacket. "Dad, yeah, buddy. That was a really good speech. You sounded like a leader. Thank you. What did you think of the whole thing?" He considered this seriously. "I think those people finally understand that you're important." But I already knew that. As we drove home through the Boston streets, Elian fell asleep in the back seat, still wearing his little tuxedo, his award ceremony program clutched in his hand. I looked at him in the rearview mirror and realized something profound. I'd spent 8 years trying to earn the respect of people who weren't worthy of mine. But I'd earned something much more valuable, the respect of a 6-year-old boy who believed I could do anything. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. 2 years flew by faster than I expected. Elian grew like a weed, all sharp elbows and endless questions about everything from compound interest to why some people sleep on the streets while others live in mansions. By 8, he was reading business magazines and building intricate cities with his Legos, each one complete with zoning plans and economic models. "Dad, why did you rename the company after us?" he asked one Saturday morning, sitting in my office chair that was still too big for him. "Because legacies aren't about the past, buddy. They're about the future." Moral Legacy Group had expanded beyond anything I'd originally imagined. We weren't just in logistics anymore. We were developing affordable housing, funding scholarship programs, and creating opportunities for kids who reminded me of myself. The Castell properties I'd acquired were being converted into mixed-income communities instead of luxury condos that only the wealthy could afford. I made peace with Maurice, visiting him once at the rehabilitation center where he was learning to walk again after his stroke. He looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that reminded me that revenge against broken people isn't really victory. "I'm sorry," he said, and I could tell he meant it. I didn't forgive him. Some things can't be undone with apologies. But I stopped carrying the anger around like a weapon. Elian deserved a father who looked forward, not backward. 5 years later, I sat in Lincoln Elementary's auditorium watching my son, deliver the valedictory speech for his 6th grade graduation. At 11, Elian had my stubborn determination, but somehow without the sharp edges that came from growing up unwanted. "My father taught me that people may laugh at you at first," he said into the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "But when you build, protect, and lead with purpose, they listen." The tears came before I could stop them. This kid who'd started life as a symbol of my wife's betrayal had become the best thing that ever happened to me. Not out of pity or charity, but out of genuine love and mutual respect. As the applause filled the auditorium, I looked around at the other parents. Some I recognized from school events, others were strangers. All of them proud of their children, all of them part of a community I'd never thought I'd belong to. They laughed at me once. I whispered to myself, watching Elian shake hands with his principal. Now they listened to my son. In the end, that was all the justice I ever needed. Not the corporate takeover or the public humiliation of people who'd wronged me, but this moment. Watching a remarkable kid who called me dad prove that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something they can never tear down.